Mike Chimombe and Zimbabwe's missing millions, and then there is the presidential gold scheme. But before we get to the meat and bones of this discussion, let's just get some background to all this. And it comes from none other than Passion Java himself. That's him in the clip above doing the narrating.
Yes. Tiri panapa tina boss Mike tine mawachede ma 20,000 maringi edu aya twerete maguchi takachena vakutakidza mansion. Yes water feature
yeah inike kaipa ikipinda somchuluko chironi bagesi shit
ione the three story kakubauko ko yes they need to know in case they don't know.
Welcome to Afro Perspectives. Today we explore how the case of Chimombe and Mpofu exposes the rot at the heart of how Zimbabwe is running its criminal justice system. For those of you who might have an idea of how criminals are tried in the courts, that mansion Java is arrogantly flaunting in that clip is exhibit number 1. No, I'm not suggesting that Java has been convicted of any crime. That is up to the courts in Zimbabwe to decide. And even then, I myself might end up standing in the dock accused of contempt of court, or even worse, prejudging the outcome of an ongoing criminal case. Just to give you the background, on the 22nd of October, just 4 days ago, Mike Chimombe and his business partner, Moses Mpofu, were tried in the High Court in Harare before High Court Judge Pisirayi Kwenda, and were found guilty of fleecing the Zimbabwean public coffers of $7 million in the so-called presidential gold scheme scandal. Well, at least that is what the newspapers have reported. We have been told that Mpofu and Chimombe bid for a tender using a firm that did not exist, a company that was not on the register of companies, and then they were calling it Blackdeck Pvt Ltd. So at the beginning of this clip, I showed you Passion Java bragging with Mike Chimombe himself, telling the whole world that Chimombe is building a 3-story private mansion somewhere in Harare. And even then, it's not even 3 stories, just a ground floor construction with a single floor above it. But that's besides the point. The point is that that's where the $7 million or parts of it went building that mansion. So this is where we are. If you're wondering why I'm frothing at the mouth, kupupira furo, this is the reason. But you might want to ask, why is this case of any interest to Zimbabweans or even the wider world? Well, for starters, Mike Chimombe is part of a bigger and wider network of shady tenderpreneurs who are milking or have milked public coffers in the past, and in the process they deprive public sector institutions in Zimbabwe, institutions like schools and hospitals, of scarce resources they need to operate. The Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, the ZAC, has copies of audio clips leaked on the social media platform WhatsApp, where another tenderpreneur, the famous social media personality Wicknell Chivayo, is heard arguing with both Mike Chimombe and Moses Mpofu. And what were they arguing about? Well, Chimombe and Mpofu were venting their frustrations at Chivayo, to the effect that they did not get their fair share of the deal from the tender to supply materials to ZEC for the recently held elections in 2023. At this point in time, some of you might want to point out this is stale news, out of date, and this is all well known, it's in the public domain. But let me just point out one thing. The first thing is that the Chimombe and Mpofu case exposes how rotten Zimbabwe's system of governance, at least when it comes to bringing those accused of crimes to justice, how it is rotten, and more to the point, Mike Chimombe and Moses Mpofu are just the low-hanging fruit, if you would allow me to use an idiom common in this part of the world where I now call home. They are the easy pickings, those who are being sacrificed to protect the bigger fish up the food chain. Consider this: Moses Mpofu and his partner in crime, Mike Chimombe, were supposed to deliver 86,000 goats, but they only delivered 6,978 goats. And here is where it gets interesting. The 86,000 goats were just for the price of $7 million US. And if you factor in that with $7 million US, one gets 86,000 goats, what we are not being told is how many goats you would get for $80 million US. Who else was supposed to deliver the 80 million of goats? So, besides the questions raised by what Chimombe did or did not do, we are left with one big mystery. If the entire presidential goat scheme was worth a staggering 87 million US, you might have to excuse the pun here. What we have to ask is, what happened to the remainder, the 80 million US? Perhaps this is one question that we will never be able to solve. So in the end, just this was one missing link to the puzzle, exposes the Chimombe and Mpofu trial for what it is, one giant charade. So this is where we are. We have a trial that has left us with more questions than answers. From this one giant gaping hole in the whole process, one is left to conclude that there are other tenderpreneurs out there, not just Chimombe and Mpofu. It's not just Chimombe and Mpofu who looted the presidential goat scheme. So, who are these faceless people? And will the Zimbabwean public ever know their identities? Incredibly, here is where I fail to grasp how we ended up with Chimombe and Mpofu being the only people facing trial in a court of law. So, after all is said and done, who decides who gets punished or who remains a free man in cases like this? I am not suggesting that Chimombe and Mpofu should not have gone to court or should not have stand trial. No, that's not my point. What I'm driving at is that Zimbabwe has lost millions or even sums running into the billions through these shady tenders awarded to those with connections to the political elites. Remember the Command Agriculture Scheme. The tenders in that scheme were a gigantic scheme estimated to have been worth over $3 billion US, and it was all with the noble intention of enabling farmers in the rural communities to acquire seeds and other farming inputs. And that was in the year of our Lord 2016, or was it 2017? Oh well, my memory is no longer serving me well here. You remember Parliament itself, sometime in 2022, led by that highly talented lawyer Tendai Biti, advised the Zimbabwean public that $3 billion of US worth of inputs could not be accounted for. Has anyone ever stood before the courts or even given an account of what happened to all those billions? No, nothing. So you get the gist of what I'm driving at. You got Sakunda Holdings and Tagwire They were the main beneficiaries of the Command Agriculture Scheme, but we all know the story with Pisirayi. If I have read the reports in the newspapers right, he is now been chosen to succeed Emmerson Mnangagwa himself. So what I'm doing here is literally shouting into the wind. It doesn't matter what evidence or what sort of facts I bring into the public domain. It's just literally shouting into the void. Plus, it's nearing close to 10 years. And even if there were files relating to such a scandal, those files are likely gathering dust in some cupboard somewhere in the offices of ZAC. With Emmerson Mnangagwa as president, Pisirayi is untouchable. You would not even dare mention his name in any scandal. And even if we are talking of the well-politically connected plundering state coffers dry through shoddy tenders, the list is not complete with the biggest tenderpreneur of them all, Wicknell Chiwayo. Like his friends Chimombe, Mpofu and Java, who were bragging about the mansion they built using money looted from the presidential gold scheme, Chiwayo does not hide the extent of his criminal activities or where he got his money from. It's all there on social media. You have pictures of him seated next to piles of US dollar banknotes, where ordinary Zimbabweans consider lobola at 5,000 US dollars the expense of a lifetime. Chiwayo squandered a staggering $500,000 US dollars in March of this year, 2025. That was just to tie the knot with his then girlfriend Lulu, the lady now fortunate enough to call herself Mrs. Chiwayo. And that was just for himself. Chiwayo has splashed equivalent amounts of money for his brother Pharaoh's wedding and another equally extravagant wedding for his sister Lucy this past August. Well, some of you might want to point out that those weddings are Chiwayo's private family life. Yes, to some extent that is a valid point. But here is the catch. Chiwayo has not made even a single cent of his money through exploits as a legitimate, a genuine businessman. But well, you all know the Chiwayo story. It's a long list of scandals. 172.8 million was given to Chiwayo for the botched Kwenda solar project. Another couple of millions, 800 million in South African rand to be precise, was handed over to Chiwayo for the supply of election materials to the Zimbabwe Elections Commission in 2023, and the list goes on. It's not just Chiwayo we are talking about here. There is the first family's favorite wizkid when it comes to business ventures. Yes, we are talking about Dilesh Ngwayo. He is not only famous, he is friends with the president's two sons, Sean and Collins. And in Zimbabwe, that alone is all you need to succeed in business. Connections to the first family. For those contacts with the first family, Ngwayo and his company Drax, he was awarded 62 million in US dollars to supply personal protective equipment, those PPE kits, during the COVID pandemic. Yes, when I start talking of PPE kits during the COVID pandemic, you all know what happened. And it's a painful subject for those of us who lost loved ones during the pandemic. Let's not talk of what happened to those millions, but you ask anyone working in the public health sector in Zimbabwe, especially nurses and medical doctors, they would tell you that they were wearing the same mask, the same contaminated gloves, day in, day out. And what happened to Dilesh? Well, he pocketed his millions and is up to this day a free man walking the streets. No one has asked him not even a single question about what happened to that 62 million US dollars. So you see, when we are talking of the public procurement system in Zimbabwe, it's not an exaggeration to say that this is now the easiest way to become a millionaire. at least for those with connections to the first family and other political elites in Zimbabwe. So the question arises is, who decides amongst those responsible for looting millions from public coffers, the likes of Chivayo, Dilesh Nguwayo, that they are free to literally walk the streets with no trouble from law enforcement, while people like Mpofu and Chimombe, those unfortunate enough to be sacrificed by the system, should face the wrath of the law? Who makes those decisions? Is it the man holding the highest office in the land, Emmerson Mnangagwa himself? Or is it his two sons, Sean and Collins? Or is it the National Prosecuting Authority? Who actually decides which case gets the attention of the police? Who gets to stand trial in the courts? Yes, these are the questions any reasonable person in Zimbabwe or the wider world and the region surrounding Zimbabwe is bound to ask. Take any first-year law student. The first week of class, they are taught that any country that is free and sovereign, the top prosecutor in the country decides who has committed criminal or other wrongful acts. The prosecutor, he or she gathers the evidence and sends the evidence to the courts, and the accused is tried before competent judges in a court of law. Well, at this point, some of you might call me naive, a man who has crammed too much theory from the law textbooks. But to be honest with you, that is how a democracy works. Not only those advanced democracies in North America and the wider English-speaking world, but here I'm talking about how the system works in Zimbabwe's own neighbors, in places like Zambia, Botswana, or even Malawi. So you would want to ask me, what is Zimbabwe then? Well, Zimbabwe is no longer a democracy. In fact, it has never been a democracy at all. It has been a dictatorship all along. If you have the president and his twin sons deciding everything, who gets to stand trial, what evidence is presented before the courts, who is declared guilty, who gets free, then what you have is no longer a republic run by a president. We now have a monarch with unchecked and absolute powers. Well, I'm not inventing these things. You have heard Mnangagwa himself calling himself the new King Monomotapa. For Emmerson Mnangagwa, the model on how to run Zimbabwe is the only absolute monarchy in Africa. Yes, that is Eswatini. And guess what? He paid King Mswati III a visit just 3 weeks ago, on the 5th of September to be precise. Here, I'm talking about a problem that has been plaguing Zimbabwe for the past 25 or so years, if not for the entire 45 years of Zimbabwe's existence as an independent state. It's the problem of the political elites interfering in the workings of the judicial system. It's the problem of the politicians deciding, of those who have committed white-collar crimes like fiddling with the public tender system and looting vast sums of scarce foreign currency from the public coffers, who gets punished and who walks free. The lawyers have a fancy term for this practice: selective application of the law. It is in its most crude form the weaponizing of the courts to go after those not favored by the political elites and the system they have created. What is most frustrating is that Zimbabwe has a high-ranking public sector accountant with the fancy title of Auditor General. Her name is Mildred Chasi. After every 12 or so months, she compiles piles and piles of paperwork documenting how each government ministry has spent money allocated to it in the budget. And it also lists who has been awarded which tender and for what sums of money. So you see, it's not that the National Prosecuting Authority, the ZAC, or the police do not have records they need to go after shady characters milking public coffers. It is simply that they turn a blind eye where individuals looting public coffers are well-known socialites and have connections to the political elites. We are talking about here people like Pisirayi. They are free and they have looted public coffers. It's all in the public domain. The evidence is there. Well, you might want to ask me, why bother about those courageous enough to make millions through their audacity to commit criminal acts and who also know they will get away with it? Well, for a start, these tenderpreneurs are stealing public resources, money the government desperately needs and should be using to build maternity hospitals, roads, schools, and other public infrastructure. Do you think it's a coincidence that our own expecting mothers end up crossing the border to go to places like the public hospitals in Msina just because the maternity unit at the public hospital in Beitbridge is no longer functioning, it's no longer working? It's not just a coincidence, it's because resources are being siphoned off to a tiny parasitic and criminal elite, the so-called Ziganandas. And it's humiliating for hard-working Zimbabweans, wherever they might be in this wide world, when we witness a tiny circle of Ziganandas flaunting properties and flashy jewelry acquired through looting public coffers. We can all see kids in Binga taking classes under mud thatched huts, the kind of structures built by our ancestors more than 100 years ago, when life was a lot simpler. Or is it fair for teachers to go without basics like textbooks simply because tenderpreneurs are building expensive villas in posh suburbs like Ganil in Harare using resources they have diverted from legitimate pursuits like public health and education? Yes, we all lose out when people like Mike Chimombe build their mansions using money looted from public coffers. People like Passion Java flaunting their 20,000 watches from Gucci. Thank you for taking your time to follow this clip. Until next time, it's bye for now. Tatenda siyaona.